Sounds True presents Music as Medicine, Session 9, Harmony and Emotion, with Kay Gardner.
Jean-Philippe Rameau, in his treatise on harmony, written in 1722, said, "Harmony may unquestionably excite different passions in us, depending on the chords that are used. The function of harmony in healing music is to touch the emotions. The masters of harmony are those who write movie scores, because you know that you can be touched by just a few notes of music and put into a mood immediately, maybe before you even see what action is about to happen. The musician will know exactly what to play, what to compose, to excite passions in you. The basic concept of harmony is the same as that of healing. It's working in balance. The Sufi teacher Hazrat Inayat Khan describes harmony as threefold: the harmony of consciousness, universal harmony, and individual harmony. When we learn how to relate to other people in harmonious ways, our tone of voice is very important, because it is the tone of voice that conveys feeling. The voice of command is very different from the voice of the slave. An arrogant voice is very different from a voice of gentleness. Caring is different from cruelty in the tone of voice. The tone of voice can change the emotional feelings immediately. And it's very important that we are aware of our tone of voice to encourage harmonious activity with friends and work partners and family. So it's inner harmony and our tones of voice that are important to convey feelings, and so it is in music. Different harmonies convey different feelings. Harmony in the Western world has become the simultaneous sounding of two or more notes together, creating intervals or a chord. Here we're going to work with the very simplest aspect of harmony, which is the interval. What do I mean by interval? Well, if I play this note on my synthesizer, and I play this note with it, the distance between those two notes is called the interval. This would be a different interval. Each one has a name in Western music, but you don't need to know the name of the interval in order to feel it emotionally. Different intervals touch us in different ways. So now let's try some of these together. You can chant along with me, or you could just listen to me chanting with the synthesizer and get in touch with how this interval touches you emotionally. How does this interval make you feel? The first interval we can experiment with is the unison. In other words, I'm going to sing the same tone as I'm playing on the synthesizer. And you can sing along too, or just be aware of how it makes you feel. Are you comfortable with that? Does that bother you? Does it disturb you? Most of us will find the unison very comfortable. Feeling like home base. It's comfortable. We're all together. We're all singing in unison, all together. One. The unison is the one. Now let's try another one. if you'll remember our do, do, that's the octave. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. How does it make you feel? Is that one disturbing? Is that one comfortable? The octave is usually very comfortable too because the octave vibrates at twice the vibration of the drone tone. And so it feels very comfortable because there's a sameness about the two intervals. So that if you do want to calm down or feel centered, singing the unison with a drone tone or singing an octave or 2 octaves above the drone tone, depending on what your vocal range is, will help you feel calm, at one with the sound, or in harmony with the sound. Now, there are certain intervals that make us comfortable, and there are other intervals that make us uncomfortable. So I thought maybe I'll play a few of them, and maybe not in order, not the consonant ones, all the consonant ones together, and all the dissonant ones together, just to see how they make you feel. And either chant along or just kind of sit quietly or lie down and be aware of what feelings come up in you when you hear these different intervals. And then I'll tell you what my workshop participants feel and see if your feelings compare with theirs. Now try this interval. This interval is called the fifth. Is that a comfortable sound for you? Like the octave, the interval of the fifth is comfortable for us because it is the first overtone. It is a multiple of the drone, a multiple of the fundamental. And so it is usually very comfortable. My workshop participants felt that this evoked the feeling of home, centering, sturdiness, comfortableness, completeness. The esoteric teacher and composer Dane Rudhyar, in his book The Magic of Tone and the Art of Music, gives this fifth a spiritual function. He feels that the sound of the fifth has the power to manifest potential. He sees it as evoking electricity and the creative mind. Well, let's try another interval. Is that comfortable? No? Well, let's hear it again. That's called the minor second. And no, most people do not feel comfortable with that one. That is a dissonant interval. This minor second has a tense and uneasy feeling. My workshop participants found it to be expectant, anticipatory, busy, and mysterious. So if you're writing music or creating music and you want to get this mood, this would be an interval to play. How nice when it resolves. Now we have the potential of 12 different intervals in the musical scale, and it's really amazing to me how each one has a specific mood and can put us in a specific mood. You remember this one? I ask if you remember because there was a movie theme that used that interval. La 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 la, la 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 la. I won't go on, but you know what I mean. The love story theme. And that has a poignancy. So you can hear, just with the 3 intervals other than the unison and octave that I've played, each one has a very different character. The first one, the fifth, a feeling of solidity, centering, and comfort. The second one I played, the minor second, kind of dissonant, anticipatory feeling. And the one I just did, that's called the minor sixth, for those who need to know these things. The minor sixth has a wonderful poignancy about it. So the movie composer knows, now if I want to get somebody stirred up and emotional and into a certain mood about being in love and love lost, that's an interval I could use. You'll notice in Chopin, if you like classical music, Chopin's piano music is filled with these poignant sixths traveling in parallel motion all the way through his beautiful nocturnes and waltzes. And there's a poignancy about this man's composing. Perhaps you are mourning love lost. You have to honor that. Play some Chopin nocturnes, or work with that interval on your own keyboard and just play. And it will allow you to grieve. Each one of these intervals will allow you to move into the mood and be able to express it if you need to. Here's another interval. Is that disturbing to you? No, not usually. That sounds like church music. That's a third. That's a major third. And people seem to think that's kind of sweet. And other people seem to think it's kind of boring because we hear it a lot. But it is a comfortable and friendly, resolved, hopeful feeling, kind of square. It doesn't have the pull of the fifth. It has less character than the fifth and perhaps less character than the other intervals that we've heard. But if you want to set up a sweet mood, then you can play your thirds or listen to music in the thirds. You'll hear a lot of church music that's in that particular interval. Very sweet. So let's look at each of these intervals again as they climb in the musical scale. There's the unison. There's the minor second. There's the major second. Not quite as dissonant as the minor second. Here's the minor third. Here's the third we just heard. So I'm just moving up the scale, using the same note as the bass note. But can you see how these very simple intervals, each has an emotional quality? Here we are back at that Chopin minor sixth. And here's a more uplifting sixth, the major sixth. A bit dissonant, but not horrible. What about this one? Not comfortable. You want it to go here, to the octave, to resolve. That's the term we use in music. When you have a dissonance, you want it to resolve to a consonance. But sometimes we need dissonance. We need dissonance in our lives. If we didn't have night, how could we appreciate day? We have to have dissonance in order to stir up the emotions and then resolve to consonance. So it's all of these intervals are very, very useful to know about. To chant together with others, or to recognize so that we can hear them in pieces of music and use those pieces of music to evoke different emotions. Here's two more intervals that I think are quite important. How did that one feel? That's called the perfect fourth. my workshop participants have a different feeling about the fourth than they have for the fifth. They feel that the fourth, when sung as a chord, evokes feelings of serenity and clarity and openness and light. I remember when I was in music school, we were not allowed to use the fourth moving in parallel motion. I remember doing something like that on a theory paper and getting a big red circle. And the reason why I wasn't allowed to do that, according to my teacher, was that was a pagan progression. And I thought, oh my gosh, music is political. Because there were certain chords that were allowed by the Roman Church and certain intervals that were not allowed. And parallel fourths were a no-no. Well, that kind of amazed me, because I feel very comfortable with that. And I'm not the only one who feels comfortable with the fourth in its movement in parallel motion. Dane Rudhyar, whom I mentioned earlier in talking about the fifth being the creative principle, feels that the fourth symbolizes contraction and magnetism, and that in Indian philosophy the interval of the fourth signifies a return to the mother. The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. Hey yana ho yana hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana hey yan yan. So the religions which worship Mother Earth are naturally drawn to the fourth as the harmonious expression of a balanced relationship between them and the mother principle. Now finally, in our exploration of different intervals that we can use to evoke different moods, let's look at the most fascinating interval of all. I want to live with this one a little longer. What does this one do for you? Most people just want it to go. They want it to resolve to the fifth. But it alone, I think, is one of the most powerful intervals that we have. It's the very center of the octave. If I were to play the octave and add it, it's the very middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's right in the middle of the octave. This one, you got the big red marks on your theory papers. No tritones. This is called the tritone. The marks you got for writing this, whether you wrote it in a melody or whether you wrote it in a harmony, this was the biggest no-no of all. Why? Why should any interval be a no-no? I don't get it. I didn't get it. I still don't get it. But their reason was that this was called Diabolus in Musica, the devil in music. The main reason probably why this was called the devil in music was we had moved to a new type of tuning. In the old days we used a tuning that was much closer to nature's chord. But all of a sudden, in the 18th century, certain people decided that we should move into a more technological tuning. They decided that the octave should have 12 tones, all perfectly equidistant from each other, according to frequency. Well, we know that doesn't work in the harmonic overtone scale at all, not in the natural scale. And when the new tuning happened, the tritone, which really is the 11th overtone and is perfectly harmonious in nature's scale, because of this technological change in the tuning system, became harder to hear, became more dissonant to the listener. But if we're doing it vocally, we are going to tune into nature's chord, because I feel that because we are physically responsive to nature's chord, because it is organic, then we are going to sing it in harmony as in nature's chord, rather than in this tuning system that we call equal temperament right now. There's other really interesting things about the tritone. Probably the song that uses the tritone the best, the way that you can remember it the best, would be Leonard Bernstein's Maria from West Side Story. Maria. Of course, it does resolve to the fifth, but the words are even say it soft, and it's almost like praying. To me, this interval is the interval that will help us access the deity, because it lifts us out of ourselves and puts us in touch with a much higher consciousness. I really feel this particular interval, if chanted for a long time, one will see God without the intervention of a priest, without the mediation of a priest. I use this interval a lot in my music. Maybe it's just because I like breaking the rules and making my own. Well, actually, preferably no rules at all. But so I write this in my music all the time. And I've begun using it in vocal music. And Westerners have a terrible time singing it. It's just an interval that is not used a lot, and we're not used to hearing. And when we do hear it, we hear it in movie music, usually in horror movies or scary movies. We hear this something like... And my theory on that is that the movie composers went to music school just as I did, and they heard that this was the devil's chord. So, if this is the devil's chord, then use it in the scary movie. Well, I don't think that they were really conscious when they did that, although this interval has a very different quality when ascending than descending. Let's listen to the difference. Mainly because you hear where it's going. You know that eventually it has to resolve, and it usually resolves up to the fifth. What happens when it is descending? Very different quality. Where does it go from here? If it continues descending, that's not that comfortable, is it? Not as comfortable as the resolution when it's ascending. So maybe we can make it ascending. There again, that's comfortable. So this interval is just wonderfully spooky, but wonderfully uplifting as far as I'm concerned, but difficult for Western ears to hear. Now later when we get into melody, you'll realize how important this interval is. I want to pique your curiosity for a minute, because later when we look into the scales and the modes and the ragas that constitute melody, we're going to find that this interval, the tritone, the devil in music, appears in scales that have been invented by women, or in scales that are named after goddesses. Why is it that this interval used in so many women's scales is called the devil's chord? So let's sum up a little of what we've experienced here. How we can use these intervals in our own practices as musicians or as meditators, how we can chant on them with friends, and how they can access emotion, remembering that the dissonant intervals move the emotions immediately. You immediately respond to the dissonant intervals, the ones that don't feel comfortable. And you do respond to the consonant intervals, like the fifth and the octave and the unison, in a very comfortable way, but it's not as moving as the dissonant intervals. So these dissonant intervals can be used to break down emotional blockages. When I was teaching in Juneau, Alaska several years ago, I played a piece of music by Ravel. And Ravel, toward the end of his life, was mentally disturbed. He had seen the devastation that World War I had visited upon the wonderful city of Vienna, the city where the waltz was king. And he wrote a piece called La Valse. And really, it's almost a madman's version of what a waltz is. It starts off very consonant and very sane and ends up quite insane, and fascinatingly so to the listener. One of my workshop participants was very, very affected by this. The dissonance really stirred her up. She was having all kinds of recall of abuse in her childhood. It brought so much up emotionally for her. She had to leave. And I knew this piece was a difficult one to listen to at the end, but I had no idea the power it had. And I think we can go back to the word that we started with at the very beginning of this series, and that word is intent. Wherever the composer is when writing a piece of music, that is going to come across in the music and is going to affect the listener. So the intent with which the composer is creating the music is extremely important to be aware of. If there is a piece of music that bothers you, you might look into it. Why does this bother me? You might even want to do a little historical searching. What was going on with the composer when this piece was being written? So very sensitive people are able to pick up on this kind of thing. When we play dissonant music, we are accessing deep emotions. The intervals that I've given you have been very simple, just one note and another note. What happens when we add a third note? It's not as powerful as just two notes. That's much more powerful than it somehow loses the ability to touch the emotions. Now, harmony doesn't just happen in chords, like two notes playing at once. It happens in movement as well. In other words, if I'm moving this way, playing one note at a time, it's still harmony. It's just harmony that is horizontal rather than vertical. Vertical meaning this, horizontal meaning this. So don't put down dissonance. We don't always need consonance in our lives. Again, how do we know what day is if we don't experience night? We have to be in touch not only with the angel, but we also have to be in touch with our shadow. If we're going to be balanced, just as nature is balanced, we need to recognize both. And harmony has the ability for us to access these emotions immediately upon hearing them. There's a machine called the oscilloscope, and it shows the shape of the intervals. When playing unison on an oscilloscope, you will get a circular shape, a circle. When playing the root and the octave, you get the figure 8. When playing the root and the fifth, you get kind of a double figure 8. And as each note is played with the root tone, as it climbs up the harmonic scale, the image that the oscilloscope shows is a little more complex. So each vibration as it climbs, you can see, is more complex than the lower ones. Oscilloscopes are a modern invention, but one of the pioneers in how music creates shape lived in the last century. He was a German physicist and acoustical engineer named Ernst Chladni. And he invented a device which bears his name, the Chladni device. Imagine a piano stool. You know, the ones with the revolving round seat? But let's say that instead of a revolving round seat, the pedestal of the piano stool has a metal plate attached to it where the seat would be. And that is a static plate. It isn't moving. And Chladni would sprinkle sand on this metal plate. And the metal plate could be the shape of a triangle or a round shape or any other geometric shape. But he would sprinkle sand on the surface, and then he would take a cello bow and play the edge of the plate. And as he played the edge of the plate, the sand took specific shapes, almost like mandalas or snowflakes. And the reason for this was that there are certain places on the plates that don't vibrate. Those are called nodes, N-O-D-E-S. They don't vibrate at all. So the sand would collect on the non-vibrating part of the plate. And depending on the shape of the plate, the thickness of the plate, the shape would be different. Now this was just a curiosity for a while. Oh, how fascinating. Chladni has invented this wonderful thing. But it really didn't go anywhere for a while, as fascinating as it was, until early in this century, when a Swiss researcher, Hans Jenny, started experimenting with the same things that Chladni had experimented with. But he took it several steps further. He also had 20th century technology, so he filmed everything. And the films that Jenny has made are quite fascinating. What he does is sprinkle various materials on different surfaces, and then films what happens when music is played through the surface, so that a crystal oscillator is attached to each of the surfaces, and music is played, and whatever the surface is vibrates, and whatever he has sprinkled on it, whether it's sand or lycopodium powder, which is the powder from the club moss, a very light powder, or even liquids. He uses glycerin or molten plastic. And he films all of them to see how they react to sound. And we're so lucky to be able to have these films. When one sees these films and hears just single sounds being played onto the surfaces where these particular materials are, you can see almost how Earth was created. One of the most fascinating visions on his film was a magnetized surface with iron filings. One sound is played into the magnetized surface, and the iron filings start climbing up into shapes as the sound is being played. It almost looks like mountains are being formed right in front of your eyes. And the thing that always comes to me when I'm watching these films is not just this is how Earth was created, but through sound. In the beginning was the Word. Well, in the beginning was sound, and all matter took shape. But the most fascinating thing for me is, what is sound doing to our bodies? If sound can make iron filings climb up into mountainous shapes and then literally dance across the surface, lifting heavy metal off a magnetized surface, music has that power. Sound has that power. What is it doing to our bodies? What is it doing at the molecular level? Hans Jenny called his experiments cymatics, from the Greek word chyma, K-Y-M-A, which means wave. And you can make your own cymatics machine. You don't need a Chladni apparatus to do it. Just take your boombox and lay it on its back so that the speakers are flat. And take an aluminum pie plate and put it on one of the speakers. And if you're lucky, you have a boombox that you can plug a mic into. So if you do, plug the mic into it and make different vowel sounds. Of course, you have to have something to sprinkle on the pie plate or it won't take shape. So if you know someone who perhaps teaches science, or you know where there's a science supply house, you can pick up some lycopodium powder. It's used in various experiments because it's very light. I've tried this with salt, I've tried it with flour, I've tried it with other light substances that I thought were light, and it didn't work. But if you can get a hold of some lycopodium powder, you sprinkle it on the aluminum pie plate, and you plug in your mic, and you do different vowels. And with each vowel, you will see a different shape. The lycopodium will pull into a different shape. The most fascinating example of this is when you chant Om into the microphone. The shape that the lycopodium will take is the shape of a mandala, or a piece of meditation art that's quite old. It's called the Shri Tantra. And it is a circle with interlacing triangles within, meaning that the mystics who originally painted the Shri Tantra were able to feel and see the shape of sound, the shape of the sound of creation, which the Om gives us in sound and the Shri Tantra gives us in vision. In my book, Sounding the Inner Landscape, Music as Medicine, I take some of the Chladni forms and some of the shapes that Jenny has found and compare them with electron micrographs of various tissues in the body. And it's really fascinating how some of the shapes are almost exact duplicates of the shapes within the tissue structure of our own bodies. Toward the end of his life, Jenny envisioned that cymatics would be a science to be developed in conjunction with all the biological sciences, where frequencies in relationship to the human organism could be studied. There are various people now who are using a machine that supposedly uses the cymatic principles to touch particular organs of the body. Some chiropractors, osteopathic physicians have these machines. It'll be interesting to see where this goes. They're rather new. They're not proved yet. But I'm not sure that it's always the machine that has to do it. And we talked about this earlier when we talked about toning, that we will accept it if it's a machine that's touching us vibrationally. But if we make the same sounds with our voices, we think it's kind of woo-woo. And I think that we can really access these shapes and sounds also by using our voices in toning exercises. So we don't know right now what the future will bring with regard to cymatics and the recreation of harmony at the molecular level. It's up to the scientists and practitioners of music to determine through continued research and experimentation.
This concludes Session 9. Please turn the tape over and rewind for Session 10.